Okay, welcome back to the third presentation of this module. We've already dealt with Joshua and Judges, we've dealt with 1st and 2nd Samuel, and now we're going to take a look at the conclusion of the Deuteronomistic history in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. The last lecture had ended with our reading of 2nd Samuel 7, where God gives that decree of eternal kingship, the promise of an eternal dynasty to King David. However, we didn't go much beyond that, and so let's review briefly what happens in the rest of 2nd Samuel. After David is given this decree, eventually things are going to really start to go downhill for him. You might remember that he's going to commit adultery with Bathsheba and have her husband killed, and he's going to be promised some pretty bad punishment as the result of that, pertaining to the insecurity of his reign. In chapter 13 of 2nd Samuel, King David is going to fail to deal properly with the rape of his daughter Tamar by his son Amnon. And this eventually leads him essentially to lose control of his family and of his reign, of his entire household. This is eventually going to lead to the coup that Absalom attempts to mount against David, and he almost loses his kingship and his life, except for the fact that his general Joab kills Absalom while Absalom is hanging from a tree by his hair. Because most of this second part of 2nd Samuel pertains to the question of who is going to succeed him to the throne, it is often referred to as the succession narrative. And many people think that this succession narrative is a part that was added in to the book at a later time by the Deuteronomistic historians to explain how David's rule came to an end, and more than that, to explain why Solomon ended up being the one to succeed him. And so the book of 1 Kings is going to start with the reign of Solomon, and more particularly the end of the succession narrative in 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2, where it's going to describe for us the struggle for the throne. Who is going to take David's place? At the very beginning of the story, the authors make it clear to us that David is basically lying on his deathbed, that both as a king and as a human being he has lost his power. And he shows that by demonstrating that David is incapable of being intimate with the young girl who has been brought in to keep him warm. And so that means that he has lost his potency as a man, and therefore his potency as leader, because the two of those would have essentially gone together back in that day. When David's son, Adonijah, sees that this is the case, in 1 Kings 1:5, he has himself proclaimed king, and he, along with the cooperation of Joab and Abiathar, is going to essentially plan a parade in which people will acclaim him as their next leader. However, not everybody is agreed that he should be the next king. Obviously, King Solomon is also a contender for the throne. King Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, wants him to be the king, as does the prophet Nathan. And so Nathan and Bathsheba arranged to each go separately to David and to ask David, do you really want Adonijah to succeed you to the throne? Of course, the hope and the plan is that David is going to then respond by appointing Solomon as his successor, which is exactly what happens. The other two characters that are involved in all this are going to be Abiathar and Zadok, David's two priests. Historians think that what happened is that when David took over Jerusalem, there were two families that thought that they deserved the priesthood, and in order to avoid a conflict and to appease both of them, David had a dual priesthood in which both Abiathar and Zadok were appointed to that position. In this instance, Abiathar is going to support Adonijah's bid for the throne, while Zadok is going to support Solomon. After David announces that Solomon is going to be his successor, in chapter 2 of 1 Kings, David has a final conversation with Solomon in which he essentially advises Solomon to consolidate his rule by getting rid of those people who might be disloyal to him. As soon as David dies, that's exactly what Solomon does, and so he has Adonijah put to death, and he has Joab put to death as well. The one remaining person is Abiathar, and he does not kill Abiathar. I don't think it's clear why. Perhaps it's because he doesn't feel comfortable killing a priest, but for whatever reason, instead of killing Abiathar, he exiles him to the village of Anathoth, Anathoth, which is just a few miles north of Jerusalem, far enough to get him out of the way, but close enough to keep an eye on him. The important thing to remember here about Abiathar is that his family is going to continue to live in Anathoth for the next several centuries, continuing to live there as the priesthood in exile, in essence, perhaps feeling that they are the ones who should be running the temple in Jerusalem. A good number of scholars also think that it's Abiathar's family who eventually become the authors of the Deuteronomistic history. Okay, so as we are reading this material, remember that it's being put together by the family, by the descendants of Abiathar, who probably think they are the ones who should have been allowed to hold the priesthood in the first place. In any case, after Solomon takes the throne and deals with these potential threats, he sets about to settle himself in Jerusalem and undertake a very ambitious reign. The well-known story in chapter 3 tells about God offering Solomon whatever he would like, and Solomon, instead of asking for wealth, fame, and fortune, asks for wisdom, to which God responds, yes, you will have the wisdom, and because you have made such an astute choice, you will also have all the fame and the wealth that you did not ask for. Solomon's wisdom is then demonstrated in his judicial decision between the two women who are having a dispute over a baby. Chapter 4 is going to continue to tell us about all of the administrative structures of the empire and all of the people that Solomon needed to keep running the kingdom, so to speak, and to continue to grow the nation. Note in particular chapter 4, beginning with verse 20, where it tells us that Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. A direct reference to the promise that God had made to Abraham of descendants as numerous as the seashore. That promise is now being fulfilled. The borders of his kingdom are described in chapter 28, which are about as big as Israel and Judah ever were. Solomon's wisdom is famous, and so at the end of chapter 4, people come from all around to hear him speak. He composes 3,000 proverbs, 1,005 songs. Verses 33 and 34 tell us that he knows both about botany and zoology, and people come from the nations to hear his wisdom. He is a true Renaissance man. Beginning in chapter 5, we're going to have a description of Solomon's building of the temple. You will remember that when David had originally wanted to build the temple, he was told that by God that Solomon will build it instead. It takes a lot of work to get a temple up and running, especially a temple of the size that Solomon built. And so in chapter 5, verse 13, I would point your attention to the notice that King Solomon conscripted forced labor out of all Israel. Okay? In other words, probably a reference to the northern kingdom. They forced these people from the north to come down and help build the temple. He sent them to the Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. And so in chapter 6, it's going to describe more precisely what the temple is like. And here's kind of just an outline of a couple of things I need to make you aware of. We've got the most holy place, which is sometimes referred to in the NRSV translation as the inner sanctuary, as it is, for example, in chapter 6, verse 19. This is where the Ark of the Covenant would have been located and the cherubim. This is the place where only the high priest could go once a year to be in the presence of God. The altar itself, where the sacrifices are offered, is not within the most holy place, but you can see here that it is to the outside instead. That's where the animals would have been slaughtered as part of this sacrificial cult. I would also encourage you sometime to read 1 Kings chapter 8, particularly Solomon's prayer of dedication for the temple in verses 22 through 53. You might remember that I mentioned earlier on in this module that one of the things that the Deuteronomistic historian often does is to emphasize his key points in speeches given by the major characters And there's a good example of this in chapter 8. At one point, for example, Solomon prays to God that God would forgive the sins of the nation if somebody sins, simply by having them look at the temple. So in other words, he says, if someone sins, may they look at the temple and be forgiven for what they have done. The rest of his reign is going to continue to describe kind of an environment of opulence and magnificence. I've always been interested in the fleet of ships that he built at Evian-Gezer in chapter 9, verses 26 through 28. In chapter 10, we're going to have the visit of the Queen of Sheba. The fabulous wealth that Solomon built up is described, for instance, in chapter 10, beginning with verse 27. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedars as numerous as the sycamores in the Shephelah. In addition to having all of this wealth, he's going to have a tremendous military force of horses, and that's also described kind of in the same section. Let's go back to verse 26 of chapter 10, where it tells us that Solomon gathered together chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. Then in verse 28, his import of horses was from Egypt and Kue, and the king's traders received them from Kue at a price. So in other words, what a magnificent, opulent life Solomon has built up for himself, for his palace, perhaps for some of the nation. Wealth, horses, and the building of a new temple. Foreign relationships or relationships with other nations for his foreign policy. However, let's think about this a little further. What we're going to find out is that maybe all of this wasn't quite as positive as we might first know. The Deuteronomistic historian who put this all together is going to be aware that hopefully as readers we have already read and will remember something that was written in the book of Deuteronomy. You'll remember we said that Deuteronomy was spoken by Moses in Moab, kind of to function as a constitution, a guiding law document for the Israelites as they established their life in the land. Like most constitutions, Deuteronomy is going to bring up the idea of leadership, or is going to address the topic of leadership and say who the leaders are, what their responsibilities should be, and what the limits should be on those responsibilities. And in Deuteronomy, we find all of that in chapters 16 through 18. In the section of Deuteronomy pertaining to the king, it tells us this: he must not acquire many horses for himself or return the people to Israel, or to Egypt rather, in order to acquire more horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you must never return that way again. And he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also, silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. Okay. So we start to see that this mention of all the horses and all of the silver that Solomon acquired was not at all to be a congratulatory statement, but is to introduce us to some of the dangers that are going to affect Solomon's rule and are going to be in direct contradiction to how God had told the people to live and how their king should conduct himself. Also, notice that in Deuteronomy it says he must not acquire many wives for himself. Let's take a look at what 1 Kings says about that. You'll notice in chapter 11, beginning with verse 3, among his wives were 700 princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. Which is exactly what Deuteronomy had predicted would happen. And so we're getting into that part now of 1 Kings chapters 11 and 12, which is going to describe the downfall and the failures of Solomon and the tragedy to which those lead. So these wives were probably from foreign countries. A lot of these marriages were political marriages that had been made along with treaties or agreements with other nations. But it mentions that these wives are going to turn away his heart. Verse 5 and 6 will talk about all the gods that he followed instead, as well as verses 7 to 8. And in verses beginning with verse 9, it tells us that God is angry with him. And in verse 11, the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your mind, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and I will give it to your servant. And so Solomon has been disobedient, and he has promised that the kingdom will be torn away from him because of that. And so that's going to bring us to the next major event in the book of First Kings, which is going to be the division of the kingdom between north and south. And all of that is going to start in chapter 11, verse 26, in a conversation that Jeroboam has with a prophet by the name of Ahijah. Ahijah comes to Jeroboam, tears his garment into 12 pieces, and says to Jeroboam in verse 31, take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, see, I am about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon, and I will give you 10 tribes. One tribe will remain his for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city that I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. So you see, as punishment for being unfaithful to God and worshiping these other deities, Solomon is going to have the kingdom stripped away from him, but not all of it. His family will be allowed to hang on to one tribe. Why? Because God had promised David in 2 Samuel 7 that even if your son sins, I will not take the kingship away from him totally. So this is a way of punishing Solomon, but yet God's keeping the promise of an eternal dynasty. Of course, this bears ill for Jeroboam, and so Jeroboam is going to run off to Egypt in order to keep Solomon from killing him. And once Solomon dies, Jeroboam is going to return. And in chapter 12, beginning with verse 1, Jeroboam is going to have a conversation with Rehoboam. Rehoboam is Solomon's son, who is next in line for the throne, and Jeroboam in chapter 12 is going to come to Solomon and is going to tell Rehoboam, or is going to come to Rehoboam rather, and is going to tell him beginning in verse 4, your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he placed on us, and we will serve you. In other words, Jeroboam says, on behalf of the northern tribes, this forced labor was too much. If you want us to follow you as your subjects, you have to lighten the load. But if you do not, we are not going to be loyal to you and have you as our king. I've always loved this story in chapter 12, so I hope that you will read it. It tells about Rehoboam going to two different sets of advisors, his younger advisors and his older advisors, and he follows the advice given by the younger, more brash advisors who tell Rehoboam, don't you dare loosen your grip on these people. And so Rehoboam comes back and he refuses to honor Jeroboam's request, at which point Jeroboam says, okay, we are out of here. And from then on, we're going to have two kingdoms. The southern kingdom of Judah, consisting of the tribe of Judah, and the northern 10 tribes, which are going to be called Israel. And in chapter 12, verse 22, a man of God, a prophet by the name of Shemaiah, brings the word of God to Rehoboam, telling him not to fight against the north, not to mount a civil war in order to keep the north in line. However, we are going to see that Jeroboam doesn't turn out to be any more obedient to the requirements of God than Solomon had. When he takes office, the first thing he is afraid of is that all the northerners are going to continue to go back to Jerusalem to celebrate the religious festivals, that when they are there, they are going to meet all their southern friends and relatives, want to rejoin the south, and so kill Jeroboam to become one nation again. In order to prevent that from happening, Jeroboam sets up these golden calves in the cities of Dan and Bethel and tells the people that they are supposed to go worship Yahweh there instead of going down to Jerusalem. It's interesting that when he sets up the golden calves in chapter 12, verse 28, he says, here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Exactly the same thing that Aaron had said to the people when he made the calf for them in Exodus 32. As a result of this, the end of Jeroboam's reign is going to be announced also. Once more, he is going to have a confrontation with the prophet Ahijah. Ahijah is going to talk to Jeroboam's wife, and in chapter 14, beginning with verse 7, he's going to tell her that Jeroboam's reign is done, that his family will not continue to have the throne. From there, the books of 1st and 2nd Kings are going to continue to talk about the history of Israel and Judah, describing the kings alternately and taking us down from here through the Babylonian exile in 587. We're going to see that the two nations are going to have slightly different principles of kingship. In the southern kingdom, we're going to have the principle of dynastic succession. That means it will always be the father, then the son, the grandson, the great-grandson who will take the throne. There will never be any question then, for the most part, about who the successor is. It's always going to be the son. However, in the northern kingdom, they are not going to have that principle. In the northern kingdom, we might have kind of the principle of might makes right, I like to call it, as determining who's going to be the next king. In other words, there are going to be a lot of coups, murders, and assassinations as the transitions from one king to another are made. The other thing that's interesting here about how it describes the different kings is that Deuteronomy, in addition to summarizing what happens during each king's reign, is going to summarize whether each king was a good king or a bad king. There's not going to be a whole lot of gray area here. For the most part, each king is going to be either positive or negative according to how well they follow the theological requirements of worship of only Yahweh that God has laid forth. And so this is what I mean when I say that 1st and 2nd Kings is written through the lens of Deuteronomy. How well do each of these kings follow the requirements of loyalty to God that Deuteronomy had set forth? And so let's look at a couple of examples of some of these formulas. And so let's take a look at just a couple of examples of these formulae that the historian uses in evaluating the kings. In 1 Kings chapter 15, for instance, we're going to have Abijam. He's going to be reigning in the southern kingdom. And in verse 3 of chapter 15, it is going to tell us, after telling us when he reigned and how long he reigned and who his mama was, in verse 3, it will tell us he committed all the sins that his father did before him. His heart was not true to the Lord his God like the heart of his father David. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord gave him a lamp in Jerusalem, setting up his son after him and establishing Jerusalem. So all of these kings are going to be compared to David as the ideal king. In this case, he does not live up to that ideal, but nevertheless, God is still going to allow him and his descendants to continue on the throne because of that promise that God had made to David. Let's take a look now at a positive king, King Asa, beginning in chapter 15, verse 9. Again, the formula is going to start by saying when he reigned, how long he reigned, who his mother was. And then in verse 11, it will say he did what was right in the sight of the Lord as his father had done, as his father David had done. And then as it goes on to tell us what exactly it was that he had done right, it's going to be that he returned purity to the worship of Yahweh, getting rid of the temple prostitutes, the idols, removing his mother Maacah from being the queen mother, cutting down her image, and so forth. The heart of Asa was true to the Lord all his days. And so that's kind of how the rest of the books of 1st and 2nd Kings are going to go, talking about the reigns of the different kings, summarizing what happens during those reigns, and evaluating those kings as either being good or bad. Unfortunately, we don't have time really to pick up the Elijah and Elisha stories, which are very interesting in their own right. So let's jump ahead to 2 Kings 17, and I hope you'll get a chance to read a little bit of what Arnold says about the Elijah stories. But in 2 Kings 17, we're going to finally have the story of the fall of the northern kingdom. You'll remember we've been saying that the northern kingdom of Israel was defeated by the Assyrians in 722, And what's interesting about chapter 17 is that it's going to explain from a theological perspective all of the errors that led to the fall of the north. Right? And as you will read through chapter 17, I hope you'll take the chance to do that. It's going to talk about all of the sins that they had committed, and they're all going to have to do with idolatry, incorrect worship of Yahweh, the worship of other gods, and so forth. The section that begins in verse 24 is also interesting, where it's going to say that the king of Assyria is going to bring other people from outside and settle them in the land. Then these lions are going to come and are going to attack the people. And so the king of Assyria is going to try to get the people to worship correctly, teach them the law of the God of the land in verse 27 to stop the coming of these lions. This is what leads us to the phrase the 10 lost tribes. You might refer to the 10 lost, you might remember hearing references in movies or history or whatever to the 10 lost tribes, and that's what this refers to. The Assyrians came and destroyed the northern kingdom. Most of these people were scattered, and nobody knows what became of them since. One of the more common hypotheses is that eventually the Israelites who were left in the northern kingdom are going to intermarry with the people from outside the kingdom who are going to be settled there by the Assyrians, and this is what is going to produce the group of people that will eventually be known as the Samaritans. As you read through 2 Kings 17, though, you will notice that all of the things that lead to the downfall of the northern kingdom are going to be exactly the things that were prohibited in Deuteronomy. So here we have kind of come full circle. Most people think that the first edition of the Deuteronomistic history was written after this point, kind of as a way of explaining why the northern kingdom fell, and also as a way of telling the southern kingdom that if you don't shape up, you are liable to suffer the same fate that we've seen in the north. And so as we go on, we're going to see a little bit more whether they're able to do that and whether or not they're able to avoid that fate. Finally, let me close today's comments by saying just a few words about the role of prophets and kings. The first thing I want you to remember is that prophecy emerged simultaneously with the monarchy. There's a reason that prophecy really emerged as a practice at the same time, and that is because now that they have a monarch, a king, there needs to be a way to keep the king in check, to keep the king from getting too powerful. Only God now is able to prevent the leader from getting too powerful, and so God is going to do that by appointing prophets. And so we're going to read a lot of stories about prophets in the Deuteronomistic history, and a lot of those we've kind of skipped over, but I encourage you to be familiar with what's there because that's an extremely important part of this history. The prophecy and kingship emerge simultaneously because somebody needs to keep the power of the kingship in check. There are three main roles that prophets are going to fulfill. Okay? The first is that they are going to appoint kings. We've seen that Samuel appoints Saul. He also anoints David. Ahijah tells Jeroboam that he is going to be the first king of the northern kingdom. And also Ahijah announces when his kingship is done. The prophet Elisha is going to appoint the king Jehu. So they will appoint kings. The second thing that prophets will do is give oracles of judgment on kings. Samuel delivers the oracle of judgment that announces the end of Saul's reign. Ahijah announces judgment on Solomon for worshiping other gods. Ahijah also announces judgment on Jeroboam for setting up the high places. Elijah is going to announce judgment on Ahab for his worship of Baal in the north. And finally, the third function that prophets really fulfill is that they lead the nation to war. No country back in those days would have gone to war without the assistance or without the advice of a prophet, without the approval of a God given through a prophet, is how we'll put it. and we're going to see that prophets are involved in warfare a lot in Israel's history in the books of Kings as well. Okay, the rest of the books of Kings will tell us what happens between 722 and 587. And so once we get to some of the prophets, which we will start with in the next module, we're going to spend some time looking at that period of history at that time. But for now, we're going to stop. Thanks for joining me and for sticking with me for 3 lectures on the Deuteronomistic history. I hope you're having a great week.